being an ex-Jehovah's Witness, I was given stories when I was little of people who were in the concentration camps dealing with this stuff, but stood firm, quote unquote. There's a movie they made called Stand Firm, all about this. I kind of grew up like understanding that my identity is one that was persecuted and imprisoned in concentration camps in Germany because of that. But after leaving the religion, like, I don't know what I can believe about what they said and what I can't, because Jehovah's Witnesses have a tendency to, like, just lie about things, just straight up make things up. Like their claim that Babylon took Jerusalem in 606 BCE. They didn't. That's just a lie, It was 586 BCE, and they've hinged their entire like religious belief on it. If that's not true, then their whole religion falls apart. So anyway, I didn't want to get my information from Jehovah's Witnesses. I wanted to get it from a different source, a trustworthy source. So I went scouring different parts of the internet and different U.S. Holocaust Museum and Memorial and German resources and things, trying to figure out what the best book is on the subject. And I came up with The Jehovah's Witnesses and the Nazis, Persecution, Deportation, and Murder, 1933 to 1945. Not written by a Jehovah's Witness, not even like assisted by one or anything. It's an academic, a scholarly project. So I want to tell you a couple of interesting stories out of it that they've laid down here. One of the main reasons that the Nazis didn't like Jehovah's Witnesses is because they were both totalitarian systems that expected total obedience from their adherents. And funny enough, they both offer a 1,000-year Reich. So, I don't know. That's something funny that the author pointed out. When everything went down, Germany signed an agreement with the Pope called the Concordat, the 1933 Concordat. The Reichskonkordat is what it's called. Anyway, signed this agreement with Germany, with Hitler, that basically said, if Hitler allows Catholics to continue running Catholic schools and keep their after-school programs and so on and so forth, then they will swear an oath of loyalty to Hitler. The Pope said, every Catholic bishop everywhere will swear an oath of loyalty, everywhere in Germany. So Hitler says, okay, signs it. Interestingly enough, around that time, Jehovah's Witnesses were banned. Now, I have no evidence for this claim, but so temper it with that knowledge. It seems to me that it's possible that Hitler banned Jehovah's Witnesses not just for all of the other reasons that he banned them, but also because of all of the shit that they talked about Catholics. Oh my God, they hated Catholics at the time. Still kind of do. They wouldn't shut up about them. And then the Pope makes an agreement with Hitler, and then they're banned. That's weird, right? Anyway, like I said, take that or leave it. At the time, from 1920 onward, the head of the German branch of Bethel, of Jehovah's Witnesses, like main thing, guy named Paul Balzeriet, I think, Balzereit, Balzeriet. Germany was struggling a lot. For Jehovah's Witnesses, it was difficult through the 19-teens and the 20s, particularly because the religion was still very young in the 19-teens. Charles Taze Russell created the religion in 1874. I believe it was 74, made some end times prophecies that fell flat, and then he extended them, and those fell flat. Just kept doing that, I could be getting these dates wrong, but it's somewhere in this range. I believe Joseph Rutherford was hired on as legal counsel for the Bible students. That was the name of Jehovah's Witnesses at the time. In 1907 or 1909? The early 1900s, anyway, between 1900 and 1910. He's hired on as legal counsel. 1916 rolls around. Halloween night, Charles Taze Russell dies. They had a structure in which they would vote in a new president. January and February roll around the following year, so just 3 or 4 months later, or something like that. They hold the elections. They're doing primaries to choose who the candidates are going to be. Joseph Rutherford is the legal counsel still, and he runs for president. But as somebody at the top of the organization, he had a lot of power. There was still like a board of directors who would kind of control things. Well, Rutherford set up the system where nobody else was running against him in the primaries. He closed the primaries after he was added to the ballot, basically. And the board lost it on him. We're super upset. The voting comes along. He wins, obviously. Who else would win? And he immediately fires a bunch of board members, the ones that were not specifically loyal to Joseph Rutherford, were fired. That struggle had a name, and I wrote about it in my book, Understanding Jehovah's Witnesses, at length. I wrote about this whole thing. Super fascinating. Anyway, while all this is going on, World War I is happening. Austria-Hungary was like a one nation. They had their Archduke, Franz Ferdinand, assassinated by some people, and it kind of sparked World War I. They blamed it on a Serb. I think it was a Serbian. And there were like, there's a racial issue between Austrians and Serbians, a discrimination thing. So Austria used it as a justification to go in and attack the Serbs and, turn all imperialistic and take a whole bunch of other areas. And Germany sees this happening, and they're like, hey, I want some of that. So they invaded Luxembourg, which is between Germany and France, and some other places. Anyway, then they invade France. They got within 40 miles of Paris, surprisingly, and it was a big thing. Anyway, the U.S. and the U.K. get involved and start fighting Germany. A young Hitler was in the army at the time. He was a courier. He watched all of this play out, this nationalistic war, this World War I thing play out, and he's absorbing it. And absorbing the belief that Germans are superior to everybody. That was 1913 to 1919, basically. 1920 rolls around, and Jehovah's Witnesses appoint Paul Balzeriot as the leader of Bethel there. After World War I, Germany was destitute like you would not believe. Oh my God, their money went from basically like 4 German marks per dollar. You could buy $1 with 4 marks, to 8, to 16, to 100. It ended at 4.2 trillion marks to buy $1 US. Hyperinflation on a level never seen by the world. They were destitute. That's not even like a word. That's not even the right word for it. So everything was a complete mess after World War I. Just a total train wreck. Balzeriot is trying to run everything, and Jehovah's Witnesses are starting to actually expand during this time. 1923 is when hyperinflation ended. They did it by creating a new, dollar, basically, that's on the gold standard. So 1 Reichsmark is tied to $1. Anyway. I'm sorry, 1 Reichsmark is tied to, 1 gram of gold or whatever it is. Anyway, Balzeriot sets up shop and starts printing magazines for the first time in Germany. They had previously had to import them into Germany. But in 1923-24, he started actually printing them, and that's like a really big deal. So in 1924, Balzeriot hosts Rutherford, and he asks Rutherford for a new printing press because, it's growing. There's a massive demand. We want a new printing press. Balzeriot had a big beard, and Rutherford sits there in silence for a second, eating. And he says, I'll get you the new press if you take that thing off, points at his beard. That was the moment that beards were banned for Jehovah's Witnesses. It was that. And by the way, that's not Owen saying that. That's Jehovah's Witnesses' website saying it. You can still look this up on their website from their 1974 yearbook. Again, I talk about it in my book, Understanding Jehovah's Witnesses. Just check that out. So he shaves the beard. He gets the printing press, or whatever it is, the rotary press. They are super obsessed with hating Catholics throughout the entire thing, right? And there is this massive movement of insanity happening called the Volkisch movement, Volkisch, where they're obsessed with Aryans to a religious degree and believe that they are a master race who are only as weak as every other person on planet Earth, right now because their bloodline was diluted by Jews. That was like the whole thing. Started in like late 1800s, early 1900s, and it just like went downhill from there. So anyway, Jehovah's Witnesses is completely separate from that. 1933 rolls around, and Jehovah's Witnesses start kind of getting persecuted, like along with the Jews. They get banned, they get unbanned. They get banned, they get unbanned. And they only banned certain parts of it, and then they allowed certain parts, like you could believe it if you want, but you can't go door knocking. And it was just like this back and forth that was really difficult for a while. In my notes, I have here Jehovah's Witnesses were outlawed in Prussia on June 24th, 1933. Prussia was a kind of a region that was more free religiously and otherwise than other parts of Germany for a while. The German government had less direct control over them until they cracked down on the entire area. Anyway, so they're banned June 24th, 1933. That is 2 months after the anti-Jewish legislation and hate really started ramping up hard. April 1st is when that stuff happened. So Balzeriot, the guy who had to shave his beard, agreed to end his door-knocking activities in 1934. Rutherford was not happy about that. Rutherford felt like he should be standing up and saying, I don't give a shit, I'm doing this anyway, basically. So he complied with the Nazi demands to like stop meetings, stop door knocking and everything. However, he continued, Balzeriot did, to lobby for the ban on Jehovah's Witnesses to be lifted. At the time, it wasn't illegal to believe it. It was just illegal to practice it. 1935, Balzeriot is sentenced to 2.5 years in jail for being a Jehovah's Witness, basically. And that's where everything really started going down the drain, like bad. He spends his 2.5 years in prison. After his term is up, I'm reading from my notes here. After his term's up, he was sent to Sachsenhausen concentration camp. So he spends 2.5 years in prison from 1935 to 37, and then 37 onward, he was in Sachsenhausen concentration camp. In the camp, they called him Belzebuth. I'm pronouncing it wrong, I'm sure. But it was similar to his name, Balzeriot. And that word is a synonym for the devil, basically. I think it's kind of like Beelzebub. I'm assuming. I don't speak German, though. The interesting thing about Jehovah's Witnesses in World War II, though, is they were pacifists to such a degree that they were about the only inmates in concentration camps that could be trusted to shave the guards and give them haircuts, have a razor right next to their throats and not cut them, because they knew that they were pacifists. And Jehovah's Witnesses, you know, if they die there after like renouncing their faith, they're not going to make it through to paradise or whatever. So they can't do that. In 1937, when he went to the concentration camp, he was forced, Balzeriot was, to stand in front of the camp Jehovah's Witnesses and read a statement affirming the witnesses' loyalty to the national government. So, now I'm describing a real situation here. They took a Jehovah's Witness. They took all of them. They're all out there in the courtyard of the camp or whatever. One of the guards walks up to a Jehovah's Witness, grabs him by the arm, carries him over to the center, shoots him in the heart. He falls to the ground. He's still alive because, contrary to popular belief, it doesn't work that way in movies. You don't die instantly when you're shot in the heart. Your blood has to kind of leave your body before your brain shuts down. So dude's laying there bleeding out after being shot in the heart, and the Nazi guard gives him the coup de grace, the final shot in the head, and looks back to the Jehovah's Witnesses that just witnessed this and says, if you don't sign these pieces of paper that say you renounce your faith, we're going to line each of you up there and do the exact same thing one at a time. You get to watch. So Balzeriot was faced with that, and he says, okay. So he read a statement at the camp in front of the Jehovah's Witnesses that affirmed the Jehovah's Witnesses' loyalty to the national government. He stayed in the camp, though, for another 2 years. The thing that got the guy out of the camp was that he officially renounced ties to the organization. He didn't just say, we support, the war, or we support Hitler or whatever. He said, I am no longer a Jehovah's Witness. That's how he got out. Oh, by the way, Jehovah's Witnesses shunned him after that. they wrote Watchtower articles about basically what a sack of shit he was for doing that, for betraying Jehovah and all of that stuff. Let me tell one more story about this, and then we'll circle back around to Joseph Rutherford. There's a German engineer named Frank. He's a Jehovah's Witness, and he refused to say Heil Hitler and do the little salute, the Bellamy salute or whatever. He also couldn't raise his arm above his head because, he had like an injury or whatever, a disability. So walking down the street one day, and you don't say good morning to people in this environment. You say Heil Hitler. That's just what you do. So he walks by, somebody says, good morning. Guards or SS people nearby hear that, walk up to him and say, what'd you say? And he says, good morning. And they said, Heil Hitler. And he said, first of all, I won't heil anybody except for God, because in their language, in that time, that meant salvation comes from. So if you Heil Jehovah, then Jehovah is your salvation, basically. So Heil Hitler means Hitler's your salvation. He says, Jehovah's my only salvation. And even if I wanted to, I can't raise my hand above my head because I have an injury. So they send him to a concentration camp, this guy named Frank, this engineer. When he gets there, all of the prisoners, by the way, this story is being told from the perspective of a camp inmate that is not a Jehovah's Witness. He's just watching all of this play out. They get there and they line up in the morning and, report for work or whatever. And they're all supposed to say Heil Hitler and stick their hand up. Well, Frank didn't do that. He refused. And the commandant, the way the book describes it, was flabbergasted. He's like, you're not gonna do the thing? Frank says, no, salvation is from Jehovah, not Hitler. He says, what barracks are you from? Frank says, I'm from number 3. Or what dormitory? He says, okay. And they go about their day, do their work, go home. They lay down. When Frank lays down in his bed that night, guards come in, grab him, bring him out. And the way that this is being described is from someone else's perspective. The guy said they took him out of the room and he didn't return until morning, and he was black and blue, bruised, black eyes, just a mess. Don't know how he's even functioning. He's so messed up. This happened every day for a week, 7 days, until finally the commandant gets sick of it and he gets 5 guards to drag Frank out to the courtyard or whatever. The thing about Nazis in concentration camps is killing is easy. Dying for something is easy. Living for something is hard. They can take out any number of people they want at any moment. They don't want that. They want loyalty. They want to break people. That was the goal in concentration camps. Yes, they took out massive numbers of people, but the ones that they didn't take out, they broke. They wanted to force them to fall into this mold, So they drag Frank out there. Commandant says, say it. Say Heil Hitler, raise your hand. And Frank refuses, says no. And so the guards start raising his hand for him. They, holding it up, and they say it. He refuses. So the guards beat him unconscious. And the way it's described here, let me just read the paragraph. He was unrecognizable. They tried to force him to say it. These are my notes. This is how I phrased it. The SS took him to the courtyard at the camp and said, raise your arm. Every time they said it, he didn't. Each time he was beaten. They beat him until he was unconscious. His blood froze on the ground where he lay. When he was told again, his face hardened and he refused. When we passed him, we'd give him little salutes to encourage him to do it so he isn't beaten again. The SS made bets about him. Will salute, won't salute. After a few weeks, he returned to the dormitory. He was supporting himself against the wall. He met an SS in the He met an SS, a guard in the vestibule. His right arm came up awkwardly. The extended hand was coated with dried blood. He murmured, Heil Hitler. So he finally did it in the end. The guy did. Frank. I don't know if Frank survived. I'm not sure. I would guess not. Thousands of Jehovah's Witnesses had this exact experience. And as a matter of fact, Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, came to one of the camps and saw how Jehovah's Witnesses were acting. And he went through the whole march, telling them, say Heil Hitler or whatever, and they refuse, and, they'd get beaten again. He observes all of this, goes back to Hitler and says, their fanaticism is off the charts. We need to program this into our people. And Hitler basically said, that's stupid. I don't want any mystical nonsense, any supernatural nonsense in what we're doing here. For the record, Hitler, I don't think he was an atheist. It was complicated. Anyway, the point is, Jehovah's Witnesses were willing to die and did die to maintain their political neutrality at this time. That's how real it was. People were dying. I mean, people were being shot in the head in front of them. And they would give them these pieces of paper and they'd say, sign this and you can go. And almost nobody did. But when you're tortured and beaten to that degree, as Frank, what are you supposed to do? Everybody has a breaking point. Everybody. Now let's circle back to Joseph Rutherford. In 1933, Joseph Rutherford wrote a letter to Hitler, and the letter was referenced in one of their yearbooks and later removed from the yearbook. But we have a copy of the letter, as a matter of fact. Now remember how serious these people were about not getting political under any circumstances. Any. In 1930 to 33, people could see like the Volkisch movement ramping up and knew things were getting real and didn't know what to do about it, really. So what Rutherford did as the head of Jehovah's Witnesses across the world was he wrote the Declaration of Facts and a letter to Hitler. The Declaration of Facts, these were both in German, of course, but we have copies and they're translated. So I'm looking at the original documents here. It's on jwfacts.com/watchtower/Hitler-Nazi.php if you're interested in this. But the Declaration of Facts was reprinted in the yearbook in 1934. It went on in part to state, quote, it's falsely charged by our enemies that we've received financial support for our work from the Jews. Nothing is further from the truth. Yeah, that was one of the charges against. It was the claim that Jews had infiltrated every area of society and they were controlling everything. Up to this hour, there's never been the slightest bit of money contributed to our work by Jews. Remember, this is coming from Joseph Rutherford to all of Germany, all the German people. So I think this was published in 1933, but it was in the 34 yearbook either way. We are the faithful followers of Christ Jesus and believe upon him as the Savior of the world, whereas the Jews entirely reject Jesus Christ and emphatically deny that he's the Savior of the world, sent of God for man's good. This of itself should be sufficient proof to show that we receive no support from Jews, and that therefore the charges against us are maliciously false and could proceed only from Satan, our great enemy. The greatest and the most oppressive empire on earth is the Anglo-American Empire. By that is meant the British Empire, of which the U.S. forms a part. It has been the commercial Jews of the British American Empire that have built up and carried on big business as a means of exploiting and oppressing the peoples of many nations. You catch that? What he just said? To all of Germany, to the German people and Hitler? It's the commercial Jews of Britain and America that built up and carried on big business to exploit the people of many nations. So Rutherford, while Frank is being beaten to death, practically, maybe to death, I don't know if the guy survived, because he refuses to take part in any kind of political anything at all, Rutherford says this. You think that's bad? Just wait, there's more. It says, this fact particularly applies to the cities of London and New York, the stronghold of big business. This fact is so manifest in America that there's a proverb concerning the city of New York which says, the Jews own it, the Irish Catholics rule it, and the Americans pay the bills. See, there's that Catholic hate right there. The present government of Germany has declared emphatically against big business oppressors and in opposition to the wrongful religious influence in the political affairs of the nations. Such is exactly our position. So, he's saying, Germany has rightfully called out Jews as being rich and shifty and untrustworthy and manipulative. That's what he just said. Germany says that, and we agree. Again, you can say, okay, well, maybe he's just trying to save his people from being, hurt, right? What about Frank? He couldn't save people from being hurt, namely himself, by just saying what was necessary to survive? Or Belzeriot, who was shunned for just saying what he needed to say to survive, to keep Jehovah's Witnesses in his district, in the country, safe. Keep them out of concentration camps. What about him? He can't say this. Why is Rutherford doing it? Instead of being against the principles advocated by the government of Germany, we stand squarely for such principles and point out that Jehovah God, through Christ Jesus, will bring about the full realization of these principles and will give the people peace and prosperity and the greatest desire of every honest heart. In 1937, Balzeriet, Paul Balzeriet, like the head of the German Bethel branch, remember he was in the concentration camp and he read a statement affirming the witnesses' loyalty to the national government in 1937. And he's slammed, shredded for that. When we're like, Joseph Rutherford had just done this like years before, not even that long ago. Now the letter to Hitler. Dear Reichskanzler, I believe that means like empire leader, basically. Imperial Chancellor is what it means, head of the government of Germany. Okay, dear Reichskanzler, the Brooklyn headquarters of the Watchtower Society is pro-German in an exemplary way and has been so for many years. Dude wrote this letter to Hitler. For that reason, in 1918, the president of the society and 7 members of the board of directors were sentenced to 80 years in prison because the president refused to use 2 of the magazines published in America under his direction for war propaganda against Germany. Not really, but okay, whatever. You know, they were sentenced to 80 years. That's true. They got out of it, but they were sentenced, so fine. These 2 magazines, The Watchtower and Bible Student, were the only magazines in America which refused to engage in anti-German propaganda, and for that reason were prohibited and suppressed in America during the war. He's clearly portraying himself as subservient to Hitler and loyal to the German government, right? Dude wasn't even in Germany. He lived elsewhere, and he's swearing loyalty to Hitler right now. That's nuts. What about Frank? He can't? Just to save his own life? A little bit further down in the letter, he says, the conference of 5,000 delegates also noted, as expressed in the Declaration of Facts, that the Bible researchers of Germany are fighting for the very same high ethical goals and ideals which also the national government of the German Reich proclaimed, respecting the relationship of humans to God, namely, honesty of the created being toward its creator. That's interesting, right? Joseph Rutherford swore loyalty to the German government in World War II, like before the war, before any of this stuff got really ugly. This was published in their yearbook in 1934, but I'm not sure exactly when it was sent or when it was like distributed. On June 24th, 1933, I have this in my notes, they were banned in Prussia. And J.W. Fax here says, in an attempt to appease Hitler into lifting the ban, Rutherford instigated a declaration of facts and sent a letter to Hitler discussing Watchtower's support of the Nazi regime. Quote, therefore, I believe this is from their yearbook. On June 25th, 1933, a declaration regarding their ministry and its objectives was adopted by Jehovah's Witnesses at an assembly in Berlin. Copies were sent to all the high government officials, and millions more were distributed to the public. Nevertheless, in July 1933, the courts refused to grant a hearing for relief. Early the following year, a personal letter regarding the situation was written by Joseph Rutherford to Adolf Hitler and delivered to him by special messenger. Then the entire worldwide brotherhood went into action. And I believe that it's about to describe a situation that I'll just tell you about because I've read about it in the book. So, Declaration of Facts was from 1933. Letter to Hitler was written in 1934. So, they're banned, right? And they immediately set out to battle this out in court because Germany at the time was a democracy with like a constitution and everything. Exactly like the US, like so similar it's crazy to how the United States works. They had a Congress. They even had roughly the same number of representatives. They had a Reichsrat, which is kind of like senators, but not really. But you get the idea. They had a constitution. They had a judicial system with like a Supreme Court and everything. In 1933, Hitler is appointed head of state, basically, like a president, kind of. And he uses the Enabling Act, which is like an emergency declaration of power. Like in an emergency situation, he can write laws. 1933, I think in March, maybe, February, March, he used the Enabling Act. That was when the democracy ended, but officially, on paper, it was still a democracy. So Jehovah's Witnesses battle it out in court, claiming that the German Constitution protects their religious rights. And they were correct. It did. And as a matter of fact, a judge agreed with Jehovah's Witnesses. He said, yes, you're absolutely right. The Constitution of the Weimar Republic does defend you, does protect your right. But the Nazis ignored the ruling because there is a disruption to the, quote, good order of the state, unquote. They ignored the ruling and jailed Jehovah's Witnesses anyway because they didn't want Jehovah's Witnesses to basically cause chaos. That was the claim. That was a pivotal moment in church-state relations in Germany, not just for Jehovah's Witnesses, but for all of Germany and all of their churches. They were no longer protected by the Constitution. The judges couldn't do anything for them. The Nazis centralized power after that ruling for Jehovah's Witnesses. I wrote in my notes, they weakened them by centralizing it in the leader's hands rather than being subject to the Constitution. So after that, there's a letter writing campaign, effectively. They do this exact same tactic today. They were banned in Russia in like 2018 or something, and in response, they wrote a whole bunch of letters. Every Jehovah's Witness wrote a letter sent to Putin in the Kremlin. And he's just got tons and tons of letters from Jehovah's Witnesses all around the world. Well, they did that against Hitler in Germany. So from Switzerland, Canada, United States, I have a big list here. Here's my quote on the subject. They wrote a bunch of telegrams to people. Quote, thousands came from all over the world. US, Canada, Switzerland, Great Britain, Czechoslovakia, Scandinavian countries, France, Hungary, Netherlands, and other European nations. In Budapest, Martin Potzinger declared, the telegram was accepted, but the next day I was called to the main post office. I was informed that Hungary could not forward the telegram, and I was reimbursed. So basically, back then, a telegram was where they would, there were telegram operators in the post office who would listen, and they would record the message, and they would hand deliver a message to somebody. It was like an instantaneous letter. You didn't have to wait like 2 weeks or whatever for it to arrive. So Jehovah's Witnesses start paying to send telegram after telegram, thousands of them, to the post office addressed to Hitler. And that infuriated Hitler to such a degree that he said, quote, this mob will be exterminated in Germany. And it set off a wave of arrests at that point. Anyway, I just wanted to tell kind of a real story from World War II about real Jehovah's Witnesses, told from the perspective of somebody that's not a Jehovah's Witness. I want to kind of break through a lot of the propaganda that Jehovah's Witnesses hand down. Like, they'll claim no Jehovah's Witness in any of the camps ever renounced their faith. None of them said that they agreed with the government or anything. That's just not true. And you know what? I don't blame them for that. I don't blame them for renouncing their faith or whatever. I don't. They can believe it in here, but on the outside, if you want to live, you have to tell them you agree with them. That's just how it works. Everyone has a breaking point. I do not blame Jehovah's Witnesses for just saying okay, but Jehovah's Witnesses do. Like I said, Balzeriot was shunned for doing exactly what Joseph Rutherford did. And this is before shunning even existed in an official capacity in Jehovah's Witness religion. That didn't come until 1952. Anyway, absolutely wild. Absolutely wild that Joseph Rutherford did all of this stuff and then condemned others for doing it. Tell me what you think about it in the comments. And check out my book. It's not out quite yet, but it will be sometime in the near future. OwenMorgan.com.